Thanks so much to the Phil Society for having us and for the lively intros. I'm Kate McGrew, I'm a sex worker and I'm director of Sex Workers Alliance Ireland. Sex Workers Alliance Ireland is headed to Sweden this year for the 20-year anniversary of the Swedish model, a model that criminalizes the purchase of sex in an attempt to end demand for prostitution. In 2013, the Irish Justice Committee went to Sweden to look at the model, but spoke to no sex workers. An entire generation after Sweden introduced this model, the sex industry is still thriving. In fact, sex work organization Folkförbundet tells us there's been a marked increase, particularly in young refugee men engaging in sex work. The police officer who heads the prostitution unit has said himself, and I quote, "There will never not be a need for prostitution unit in Sweden." The double negative is his. There was no baseline research before the law in Sweden, and the sex worker rights movement was slow to grow in a society that completely gaslights. What does that mean? Oh, geez, thanks. Okay. Okay. The sex worker rights movement is slow to grow in a society that completely gaslights sex workers, saying they're either women in need of being rescued or women who are self-harming without knowing it. People need alternatives, viable alternatives for making money. In the meantime, for the work they are already engaged in, either due to little or no alternative, or because they choose it for whatever reason, they need labor rights, legal avenues within the industry, realistic reporting mechanisms and regulations. This Swedish sex worker rights movement is gaining momentum now with the help of the only allies they have there, the medical field and the LGBT community, most specifically trans people. Worldwide, sex worker allies include the WHO, ILO, ILGA Europe, UNAIDS, and Amnesty International, to name a few. At home in Ireland, only 2 years ago, it was legal to sell sex indoors and alone, and legal to purchase sex. The Criminal Law Sexual Offences Act in 2017 brought in the Swedish model. We asked Ruhama to join us in pushing for an amendment to decriminalize the relatively small number of street-based workers. This was the only decriminalization that the act brought. Ruhama agreed to join us in this push. In fact, the original law, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, were fighting for increased and included penalties for the increasing penalization of street-based workers. So, in the end, the law criminalized the purchase of sex, and it doubled penalties for brothel keeping and introduced a jail sentence. Problematically, brothel keeping law is defined as 2 or more workers working together. So, though the brothel keeping law supposedly aims to crack down on pimps and traffickers, we know from CSO statistics that in the past 5 years, it has been 96% workers ourselves that have been arrested under this law. 90% of these workers were named and shamed in the news. 100% of them were non-nationals. They are fined, they are deported, and they are left with a criminal record. Feel free to look at these CSO statistics on brothelkeepers.org. Most recently, there was an item in the news about 2 women arrested under this brothel keeping law. No pimp, no trafficker, no client even, just 2 young women working together for increased safety. They were 20 and 25, and one of them was pregnant. They were both given 9-month jail sentences. If sex workers could work together legally, they would be able to report violence without fear of arrest, deportation, and eviction. If they could work together legally, they would not be forced to work alone. If the brothel keeping law is intended for pimps and traffickers, name it in the law, so that Gardaí can no longer misapply the law and arrest workers themselves instead. I ask here for a response from Ruhama. Will you, as we asked you in 2017, therefore now join us in the 2020 review of the law to legally clarify the brothel keeping law, to make legal independent workers working together? Likewise, I spoke with Senator Bacik in 2017 outside the Dáil, asking if she might come to our event or take a briefing paper. She refused, saying she was done discussing and insisted she had heard all the evidence. But it's clear from Bocic's recent response to Wendy Lyon that she is not aware of the brothel keeping law's actual application, as she suggested that it has succeeded in arresting pimps and traffickers. Now that you have heard the reality that 96% have been workers in the past 5 years, I ask you now, will you sit down with sex workers to hear about the real impacts of our further criminalization, especially for workers with less agency or few or no options? Even legalized sex workers are criminalized by proxy when their clients are made illegal. I'll explain this. If a worker who is working alone, and therefore legally, is attacked or robbed, she has to weigh up the repercussions of calling Gardaí. She's weighing up the reality of being under police scrutiny. She's worried about police going forward, beginning to camp outside her home to from there on out take away her consensual clients as well, aka her income. We have seen Ruhama call for this type of surveillance. Sex workers need the money more than the clients need the sex. Clients know this and are in a stronger position now to be able to call the shots in our negotiations. In France, after the introduction of this criminal Swedish model, Medicine du Monde found 70% of sex workers experienced loss of income due to decreased rates. 42% sex workers experienced more violence. 70% sex workers experienced deterioration in their relations to police. And 38% sex workers found it increasingly hard to demand the use of a condom. Sex workers need the money more than clients need the sex. We should legalize sex work. In fact, we should fully decriminalize it. This is the specific model that sex workers and sex worker rights activists want. Sex workers do not want the legal model in Germany and Holland. Overregulation, high threshold of documentation, and restrictions around where and how to work mean that few can meet these requirements. This creates a massive black market where these people working illegally are easily exploited. Decriminalization, as in Australia or New Zealand, accommodates for the diverse realities of this already marginalized group of people who do sex work. There are more flexible options for licensing. The industry sits under labor law and not criminal law. So police can safely be called upon when there is a problem, but it's health inspectors that come to regulate the brothels. This legal model creates a marginally better framework within which we can realistically be safe in accessing justice, while as a society and policymakers we work together to address the reasons that lead to sex work. It's not male self-entitlement that leads to sex work, but the feminization of poverty. It's lack of employment for trans people. It's repressive border controls, it's inaffordable housing and lack of supports for drug users, domestic violence victims, and homeless LGBT youth. Sex work is a means of survival for these people. While we focus with actual feminist allies on preventative measures like regularizing undocumented migrants, ending direct provision, and providing viable alternatives, we must meanwhile afford people currently in sex work the safest landscape possible via labor rights. Due to criminalization and stigmatization, the sex industry is particularly rife with exploitation. Like any industry, at the far end of the spectrum of exploitation is trafficking. But in no other industry are the workers themselves who are the very best placed to see and report exploitation criminalized. We are therefore cut off from being able to work with authorities to tackle these violations. Anti-trafficking organizations such as the Global Alliance Against Traffic of Women and La Strada International recognize this, and they advocate for decriminalization as the best model. When advertising sex work became illegal in America under the Sesta Fosta law, workers could no longer use these sites to find clients. Many went back to their pimps and to working in the street. Shortly after, there was an uptick of sex workers being murdered, 8 in the following months alone. Luz Nagel, who co-chaired the IBA's task force against human trafficking, and the Tulsa, Oklahoma police force told news outlets that Sesta Fosta has made their work more difficult, as they can no longer use Backpage to track potential victims. For those who have little or no option, the more illegal the work is, either directly or by proxy, the more independent we are on third parties who are poised to take advantage of our vulnerability. Criminal gangs and traffickers are created and thrive in illegal landscapes. After decriminalization in New Zealand, besides there being no increase in trafficking as was feared, the most marked difference was a strengthened relationship between sex workers and police. In Ireland in 2017, the law that further criminalised sex work, it led to a 92% in violent crime against us. At the same time, this increase in violence was met with a 20% decrease in the numbers of people who wish their reports to be sent to the police. All workers, illegal or illegal by proxy, now have so much more reason to not reach out when we have problems. This vulnerability has been highlighted and it has made us sitting ducks. While we work to address the factors that lead to vulnerability of exploitation, the state and Gardaí should focus efforts on crime and violence that does occur, instead of wasting resources and efforts meddling with consensual sex work and pushing people already on the margins further underground. Sex workers are students, they're single mothers, they're people living with disabilities, people dealing with substance abuse issues, domestic violence victims, undocumented migrants, and many, many LGBT people. Nowhere in the world do we see the absence of a sex industry. Yet to people who would oppose legalization, it is clear that ideology is more important to them than mitigating risks for people working in a risky industry. This ideology comes from a bourgeoisie feminism that refuses to acknowledge the realities for the most marginalized of all women, refuses a harm reduction model, refuses to take direction from these women about what actually would keep them safer today. This bourgeoisie feminism thinks it is more important to fight against the pornification of culture at the most marginalized women's expense. This ideology comes from anti-immigrant sentiment. See 100% of so-called brothel-keeping arrests being foreign nationals. And it comes from the church. See how on the board of Ruhama sit 2 nuns who ran Magdalene laundries. Some proponents of this Swedish model, they put their motives for criminalization more plainly. In Canada, conservative politician Donald Plett, we don't want to make life safe for prostitutes. We want to do away with prostitution. That is the intent of the bill. And in Ireland, I was present at a meeting, the Minister for Justice at the time, Frances Fitzgerald, when she let the mask slip. The late Laura Lee, activist and sex worker, asked the minister if she remembered how criminalizing street prostitution, how it was criminalized in 1993, and after that there was a surge of violence against sex workers. Laura asked the minister if she remembered the subsequent murder of Belinda Pereira. The minister, ever focused on the mythology of a capitalist world with prostitution, ever focused on, in her own words, sending a message, no matter the collateral damage of sex workers' lives, responded to Laura Lee, but wouldn't that serve as a deterrent from entering the sex industry? 20 years on, after this model has failed in eradicating prostitution in Sweden, the continued and escalated violence has not been a deterrent for people who are desperate enough to engage in a risky way to survive. If we care at all about people engaged in sex work, and if we stop ignoring the fact that criminal laws fail to touch our reasons for being there and disempower us further, then we must now try a different direction, proving more successful in keeping people safe. Legalizing sex work affords us more control of our work. Full decriminalization for best protection. It would be only the first step for the men and women who work within the sex industry to claim their power as workers, to claim their power as contributors to the economy, and to claim their powers as members of our society. Hear, hear. Thank you.